It is 4000 BC. The densely forested British Isles is populated by the hunter-gatherers that have lived here for thousands of years, hunting deer beneath the trees and spearing fish in the lakes and rivers. Just 300 years later, and every part of these islands is teeming with farmers who grow wheat and herd sheep and cattle. These farmers were ultimately the builders of vast stone monuments, like Newgrange in Ireland and Stonehenge in England. So who were these people? Where did they come from? Why did they build these monuments? And what ultimately happened to them? I'm Dan Davis, I'm a novelist, and on this channel we talk about the real history behind my historical fantasy stories. And this is the story of Neolithic Britain. First of all, we need to put that story into context. Starting around 6500 BC, Neolithic farmers moved through Europe over thousands of years, starting from the Aegean in two main routes. Over multiple generations, people travelled the North Mediterranean coastal regions all the way to Iberia, and separately through the Balkans into Central Europe. As they moved into new lands, they sometimes mixed with the Mesolithic Hunter Gatherers who already inhabited these lands, changing their genetics and contributing to their culture and knowledge. All over Europe, whole new cultures, new societies, new ethnicities began, grew and thrived before merging, breaking apart, collapsing or changing into something new. These first farmers of Europe reached the edge of northern Europe by about 5000 BC. However, then they stopped. They did not progress any further north to the Baltic and North Sea coasts for another 1000 years. We don't really know why they did this. It's thought that it took a period of climatic warming before farming these cold northern lands was a viable option. It could also be that there was no excess population who needed to find new lands. Perhaps it was also that new farming methods had to be developed for these northern soils that received less annual sunlight and suffered colder, longer winters. But it was here, in what is now France, that the two main lineages of these cultures, those of the south and those of the north, began to merge, along with a new influx of hunter-gatherer genes and culture. Here in northern France there was population growth and expansion, and a kind of cultural revolution, resulting in wholly new expressions of power and people's relationship to the land. This was when the first megalithic monuments of Western Europe were constructed in Brittany. And then, from around 4000 BC, the peoples of northwest continental Europe suddenly and apparently in great numbers moved across the Channel and began to colonise the British Isles. By the British Isles I mean all of these islands. Well over 100 of them have been inhabited, and there's more than 1000 in total. Great Britain is the largest island, and Ireland is the other large island to the west. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers had been occupying the British Isles for thousands of years before our story begins. They utilised the resources of this rich and bountiful land in a variety of ways, and were often found living on the coast or lake shores. Each group, each clan, perhaps you could call them, of hunter-gatherers had their own territories. They were not totally nomadic, and were more connected to specific places than we might imagine. Some clans might spend their summers on the coastal part of their territory and their winters inland, in a particular sheltered river valley where they could hunt fatted deer and collect vast amounts of acorns and hazelnuts. They loved hazelnuts, they enjoyed roasting them on the coals of the fire, and archaeologists find blackened hazelnut shells in enormous quantities, showing where these Mesolithic people were and at what time of the year they had come. These were an enormously successful people, the masters of their environment, although they never did much to change it. But of course, this kind of lifestyle can only support a certain size population, even in a landscape with the great abundance of the British Isles. So what happened to them? Once it was believed that the hunter-gatherers gradually adopted the farming lifestyle from the peoples across the English Channel, but now we know that isn't the case. To the east of Britain around this time, the farmers of what would become the Bell Beaker culture were moving north into the lands of the Mesolithic style pitted ware culture hunter-gatherers. And as I said in my videos on these peoples, there is evidence of their ongoing interaction, tools and produce from one society ending up in the settlements and graves of the other. It would make sense if we saw that kind of interaction happening in the British Isles, because we know the Mesolithic hunters were experts on the sea. They paddled their logboats and coracles to all of these islands, even through the dangerous waters of the Outer Hebrides. So it wouldn't be surprising if they had close trading contacts with the farming peoples across the Channel. Unlike in Scandinavia though, there is no evidence of this at all in the British Isles. But there is one exception. The site of Ferratas Cove in southwest Ireland. This is the most westerly part of Europe, sticking out into the wild seas. It might seem like an Atlantic peninsula is a harsh place to live, and it certainly can be. But I have ancestors from southwest Ireland, and if I'm here talking to you today, then we must have done alright in this land. But back before farming came to these islands, the hunters living here in Ferratas Cove also did very nicely. And, like most Mesolithic people, they relied heavily on maritime resources, which made this environment ideal for them, actually. But what makes Ferratas Cove so interesting is that cattle bones and a sheep tooth were found here amongst the otherwise Mesolithic remains. Now, cattle and sheep were not present in Mesolithic Britain and Ireland, so what was going on here? These were certainly Mesolithic people, and we know this because testing their remains shows that they ate a maritime diet, which the Neolithic people did not. Some researchers have suggested that the hunter-gatherers here had raided a nearby settlement of farmers and brought back the animals to slaughter and eat, but these finds date to a period earlier than any known farming settlement in Britain, so it would have had to have been an early, unsuccessful colonisation attempt from the farmers across the sea to the south, perhaps from Brittany. Others have suggested that the Mesolithic hunters crossed the sea themselves, paddling to France to bring back domesticated animals or slaughtered bits of them. Now that seems like a long way to get your dinner, but such a voyage was technically possible, so perhaps that is what happened. There is no agreement about how to interpret this site. However, it provides a window, a murky window perhaps, into this moment in the history of these islands, when two distinct peoples and two different ways of life were first coming into contact here. What happened next would dramatically change these lands forever. As an Englishman, it's impossible to grow up unaware of the Neolithic. It's all around you, for one thing, and you learn about it in school, and it's often on TV. At least it used to be, now it's on YouTube. So I learned about it as a boy, and retained some sense of the period as I grew up. I knew enough to know that they were a people tied to the land, and that they lived in small squarish huts, not the roundhouses that came later. And they grew cereal crops like wheat, so they could make their bread. Also, I knew that they were so obsessed with death that they built enormous communal tombs, and that communality was central to their way of life. That they were a somewhat egalitarian society without the vast social hierarchies that evolved later. And I knew that much because I also learned how different their lifestyle was to the Bell Beaker culture that came after them. Much more than that, however, I never really knew. Even after I read popular books by archaeologists like Francis Pryor, I never really got a sense of who these people were, because all we have left is their tombs and a few post holes and potsherds, and their monuments are a mystery. It's far easier to imagine life in the later Bell Beaker culture, because for one thing, the general Indo-European worldview is so familiar. We know from Greek myths and the Iliad, from Norse myths and Beowulf, how these people perceived the world and their place in it. But the Neolithic farmers were always beyond understanding. So to tell their story to you now, I want to put it into a narrative framework of their arrival and settlement, their growth and collapse, and their successful new way of life. Successful until it was ended. Back we go then to about 4000 BC, when quite suddenly there was a large-scale colonisation of the British Isles from the adjacent lands across the sea to the south. Precisely how that happened is still debated. It's possible that one early route started from Brittany somewhere around 4300 to 4000 BC and went north through the Irish Sea. The evidence for this is specific types of collective tombs, such as simple early passage graves that are found on the west coasts of Wales and Scotland. and these are associated, in at least some cases, with pottery that, according to experts, resembles a type from Brittany. For example, this type of pottery from Brittany is then found from a site on the west coast of Scotland, right up here. Another suggested route is dated a bit later to between about 4000 to 3750 BC, again because of specific burial monument types and pottery in southwest England that match with styles in Normandy. And finally, there is another likely route across the channel to the east around the same time, which makes sense because it's the closest point between the shores, and this is the most well-evidenced route of them all. The pottery styles that show up here have their origins in earlier cultures of the Paris Basin and Low Countries, like the Michelsberg culture. The Michelsberg were also the ancestors of the funnel beaker culture, so it seems that some went north into Jutland, while others went northwest across the channel. Archaeologists use various methods for dating sites, such as radiocarbon dating or tree ring analysis, and so on. As powerful as these methods are, they will always have margins of error. So you might see charcoal from a hearth dated to say 3000 BC plus or minus 150 years. So that gives you a 300-year range for when this fire might have been in use. If possible, they will combine these techniques to narrow down the range. But still, when something happens quickly in prehistory, it's often tricky to piece together the precise chronology of the events. But what seems to have happened next is similar to what happened in Denmark with the funnel beaker culture. The first farmers of Britain did not merely settle the southeast corner and gradually expand in a wave of steady advance, each generation moving to the edges of their territory to set up new farmsteads when they had run out of space. Instead, there was something like a race for new lands into every corner of the British Isles over just 200 years or so. Pioneering groups must have launched themselves over the horizon again and again, leapfrogging those in front of them. One especially fast route from the south to the north seems to have been along the eastern coast of Britain. While this was happening, new colonists from what is now France, Belgium and Brittany continued to move into the British Isles, sometimes going a long way into the north and inland before settling down. As well as the locations of these first farming settlements, it's the very speed of their appearance, almost simultaneously, archaeologically speaking, that strongly suggests coastal travel was how it was done. The only other examples of this rate of colonisation are the Mediterranean expansions millennia earlier, and the contemporary expansions of the funnel beaker people. By way of comparison, the Neolithic colonisation of Britain and Ireland was 3 times faster than the earlier spread of the first farmers through Central Europe. And even they probably used rivers extensively. So it was something of a bonanza then, a great outpouring of energy from various peoples that radically altered the land. But what about those people who were already here? As I mentioned earlier, the Mesolithic Hunter Gatherers occupied different ecological niches to the incoming farmers. So for a time, there need not have been any drastic conflict. The two groups might have lived separate lives, warily watching each other from afar. Perhaps the hunters tended to move away from these new people, who apparently liked chopping down woodlands and burning the forests to the ground. Of course, these incoming farmers were themselves partly descended from the hunter-gatherers of Europe. Their ancestors had done this kind of thing many times over, all throughout the continent. The farmers absorbing some of the hunters into their societies. In fact, in Central Europe, a few generations earlier, the hunter-gatherers there had had a resurgence of some kind, and male hunter-gatherers took female farmers for their wives and took up farming. So you have to wonder if the newcomers understood the hunters' way of life far better than the hunters understood the farmers. You could even speculate that the farmers spoke a version of the hunter-gatherers' languages, or at least retained some of the vocabulary and worldview inherited from their own hunter-gatherer ancestors. And in the British Isles, and especially perhaps in Ireland, there was some mixing between the two groups. We know this thanks to genetic analysis of ancient DNA. And it's interesting to speculate what cultural impact that had on the subsequent societies in these islands. How did their mythology and cosmology and language change? And what ancient knowledge of this land might have been transmitted to the new cultures that developed? However, in a pattern repeated all over Europe, the arrival of the farmers spells the eventual end of the hunter-gatherer way of life, and it was no different in the British Isles. So now comes the rise of Neolithic Britain and Ireland. From about 4000 BC to 3600 BC, there is an enormous increase in population size as the farmers of the British Isles expanded in every direction at once, felling trees and building, in some cases, sturdy rectangular houses with walls of vertical posts, and growing wheat and raising cattle, sheep and pigs, with new generations striking out to do the same in new lands. Their farming settlements consisted of individual houses and also small hamlets. This is unsurprisingly similar to the early funnel beaker settlements. In Ireland especially, it seems, there was an early house boom as these structures were built in large numbers. Some people argue that these large houses are in fact special ritual or trade sites, while most people lived in far flimsier buildings, found today as more ephemeral marks in the ground, with flint scatters and hearths to indicate that people were living here. It was long argued that the Neolithic was a relatively egalitarian time, but more recent evidence is showing that wasn't the case. I haven't seen this said anywhere, so it's just me speculating here. And remember, I'm not an expert, I just make up stories for a living. But these large rectangular buildings could be early evidence of the homes of the elites. It's interesting that they appear more in Ireland too, considering that there is clear evidence of a hereditary elite found here, that we know of through genetic analysis of burials in certain megalithic tombs. And thinking about the pattern and speed of migration, I wonder also if this was motivated and organised by the elites of the period. Later on, of course, they would be able to motivate hundreds or potentially even thousands of people into great building projects that transformed their landscapes. So why would they not also have been behind these mass movements of people? But enough speculation for now. During this initial settlement and growth period, flint mining was also pursued with great energy. As soon as they arrived in suitable areas, such as the chalk hills of southern England, they began digging flint mines to extract the nodules that they used to make their tools. They used their excellent polished flint axes for felling trees and woodworking, and for chopping through roots as they cleared the land for growing their crops. So they raised their cattle, sheep and pigs, and grew and harvested their wheat, and managed their land, and built a variety of quite small tombs of various kinds for some of their population to be interred in. All the while, their numbers continued to grow, and new land was cleared, groups grew larger, and new settlements were founded in virgin lands. This, about 400 years after their settlement began, was the demographic peak of Neolithic Britain and Ireland. But all this was about to change. After the huge population increase from 3600 BC, there was a decrease in population for 300 years until 3300 BC to a level less than half the peak population. This lower level of population lasted another 800 years until 2500 BC, the end of the Neolithic, when the Bell Beaker people arrived. The population estimates come from the number of sites, the human and animal remains, and from evidence that the forests were cleared on a vast scale during the population boom. But when it collapsed, the woodlands regrew in many places, until the arrival of the Bell Beaker people, that is, when the secondary forests began to be cleared once more. Now, throughout history, population numbers have gone up and down in response to the availability of resources, and it shouldn't necessarily be thought of as a kind of disaster. People are capable of adapting their societies to various challenges. For example, anthropologists have studied traditional societies in historical times and seen how women in some places will choose to space births over a longer period to consciously reduce the birth rate in response to limited resources. However, in just a few generations, there were over 50% fewer people in the British Isles than there had been. It's difficult to imagine this happened without some increase in the death rate too. And whatever caused it, and however it happened, this is a drastic change. But in fact, this boom and bust pattern is seen in many places across Europe. When farmers move into an area, population increases and then collapses. Exactly why is debated. Sometimes it has been linked to climatic changes, and it is often said that over-farming of the land has destroyed soil fertility. There is some evidence for both of these in the population decline in the British Isles, but it's not yet well understood. However, after about 3300 BC, the decline stopped, and a new equilibrium was reached. The population did not decline further, and it did not increase. This was because the people had discovered a new, sustainable way of life. The evolution of many human pathogens is linked to our relationship with domesticated animals. The diseases originate in the animals and cross to the people who manage them, who then build up a resistance at the population level. And it has been suggested that when the Western stepherder people moved into a new area, as they did in many places in Eurasia throughout the 3rd millennium BC and later, they brought diseases with them that wiped out the settled farmers, allowing the steppe people to move in to the newly depopulated lands with ease. The reasoning behind this argument being that the milk-drinking, beef-eating steppe herders lived in close proximity with animals, especially cattle, and so their populations built up a natural immunity to diseases like cowpox, whereas the Neolithic farmers of Europe ate a low-protein, high-carbohydrate grain-based diet who had no resistance and died off on contact. But this distinction is not accurate. In my Kikutani Tripilia video and my Funnel Beaker video, I spoke about the importance of cattle for their milk, meat and hides for these Neolithic farmers of Europe, and in Neolithic Britain and Ireland, cattle were even more important. Residue analysis of ceramics shows that dairy was enormously important, as was the meat of cattle, sheep and goat. In these kinds of analyses, the residues of ruminant fats are not differentiated, so we can't always narrow it down. One study of sites from across the British Isles showed that about 80% of the residues in the ancient pottery studied were from dairy. 80%. Although there was regional variation, for example in the south of England it was 70%, with most of the rest being meat. And in Ireland, they ate even more dairy than elsewhere. But still, everywhere in these islands, the people were dairy farmers. Now, they hadn't evolved lactase persistence, but that didn't stop them consuming huge amounts of dairy products. It was vital to their diet right from the moment they crossed over. In fact, we should just take a moment to appreciate how incredible it is that they brought all these sheep and cattle across the channel in their logboats and coracles. We know that the people of Europe had logboats from at least the Mesolithic, and it's thought that they would have stretched the skins of cattle and seals around wooden frames to make boats too, but we don't know for sure. In my novel Thunderer, I show contemporary people in Denmark crossing the sea with logboats that are lashed together to make multi-hulled craft. We don't know that that's what they did for crossing the seas, but it's possible, I think. They might even have made more sophisticated vessels and erected some kind of primitive sail, but we just don't know, because of course timber from these times survives very rarely, and coastal sites especially have long been eroded or submerged. But whatever vessels they used, it's important to remember just how much of a seagoing people they were. There is this image that people have, at least I know I used to imagine them this way, of Neolithic farmers as people tied to the land, demonstrated by their great monuments of course. But they can only have made these crossings to these islands and between them if they understood the tides and currents on a profound level. Even if they didn't do much fishing or hunting of marine mammals, they were still maritime experts. I imagine that they trussed up young animals and bound them into their boats for the passage across the open water and then along the coasts. But just imagine trying to do that yourself, paddling across at least 30 miles, maybe 70 miles or more of choppy seas with swift currents that no amount of paddling could ever overcome, and some of the largest tidal ranges in the world with a cow in your canoe. One mistake in that situation and you're sunk. But they depended on cattle. They could not live without dairy. Their way of life was not possible without those cows, and so they had to bring them with them and ferry them around between the islands afterwards. And after the population crash, it became even more important because a very interesting thing happened to the farming patterns in Britain and Ireland. The range of crops in Britain was always narrow compared to that farmed on the continent, here comprising mainly emmer, and to a lesser extent barley as the main crops. Unlike their ancestors in southern and central Europe, it seems there was practically no einkorn or free threshing wheat, and no evidence of pulses. Obviously they weren't into beans back then, and the genetic diversity of the crops they did have might also have been limited. So perhaps it was this lack of a diversified agricultural portfolio that contributed to the crash of their economy. Nevertheless, they did perfectly well with what they had for centuries. They cleared forests for farming plots and used the manure from their cattle to increase crop yields. And they also created forest pasture for their cattle to graze, and finalised clearances with burning, and managed woodland by coppicing. These people used sophisticated land management systems in cycles that ran over many years. Using these kinds of systems, their fields were probably productive for more than 10 years before they needed to move on. However, this system did not last. In previous videos, I have said that herders of the West Eurasian steppe practiced a kind of pastoralism called transhumance, that is, moving between summer and winter foraging zones every year. In the Yamnar example, they would winter in river valleys and move their herds out onto the steppe in summer for grazing, and back to the valleys year after year. And, perhaps rather surprisingly, that's what at least some farmers were doing in England too, even in the early phase of the British Neolithic. One site in the Cotswolds shows the people there periodically moved at least 24 miles or 40 kilometres away, along with their cattle, and back again. But whatever their exact farming methods were in different parts of Britain, they all suffered a dramatic decline. From about 3600 BC, the use of cereal crops declines and the forests begin to regrow. In the north of Britain, wheat growing stops and barley continues to be grown for a while. Barley is a hardier crop, but it produces worse yields. Before that too, almost entirely disappears by about 3000 BC. It's different in the Scottish islands to the north, however, where they have a different boom and bust pattern. Their cereal use peaked between 3500 and 2800 BC, which coincides with the major monument construction in the Orkneys. More on that later. But it's interesting to note that, for some reason, the cold, windswept northern islands were booming when the mainland was in decline. Gradually giving up the growing of crops, the smaller, now stabilised populations of Britain and Ireland turned to a lifestyle based almost entirely on cattle pastoralism. And when the climate warmed again, instead of returning to growing cereals, they continued to be cattle herders. I was amazed to discover this. It was another preconception of the Neolithic that I had to completely revise. It made me wonder too about the relationship between these late Neolithic people of the British Isles and the incoming Bell Beaker people. Did they actually have a relationship before the massive Bronze Age migration? Did the cattle-based lifestyle encourage Bell Beaker Kurios groups to come raiding? After all, the wealth of these lands was walking around everywhere on four legs, ripe for the taking. We'll come back to the Bell Beaker migrations later, but now we have to talk about the most famous aspects of this culture. Their astonishing monuments, their enormous constructions that drastically imposed themselves on the landscape. And again, we can perhaps best understand these monuments in the context of the population growth, decline, and new economic equilibrium. The first long barrows were built by 3800 BC, soon after the arrival of the farmers, but it seems the great period of construction and use was between about 3750 and 3500 BC. Early monuments of what they call the Seven Cotswold tradition include examples like Wayland's Smithy and the famous West Kennet Long Barrow near Avebury, a few miles north of Stonehenge. These long barrows have stone-built chambers inside and are covered by earth with a stone entranceway and perhaps more stones on the outside. They could be enormous. West Kennet Long Barrow is 100 metres or 328 feet long and 20 metres or 66 feet wide. This was a lot of work. There were regional differences in the kinds of communal construction works carried out around the British Isles during this initial boom time. For example, those large hall-like rectangular timber buildings are erected in Scotland and Ireland, while in southern Britain people were building causewayed enclosures. I will talk more about those remarkable structures in a minute. So there were distinct regional differences, but even during this time of dense population and what was probably a more settled way of life, these people were not cut off from one another. The famous Langdale axes demonstrate that very well. These axes were made from a distinctly green-coloured, fine-grained volcanic tuff, which occurs at Langdale in the Lake District. This material makes attractive axes, but it was extracted from a very dramatic mountainside next to a sudden plummeting drop. It was a bit of an ordeal to reach this place, so there must have been something very special about the location. Well, you can see that there was. The place was special. The stone here was wonderfully attractive, but it was not unique, and yet here was where it had to come from. And these axes end up all over Britain, sometimes in burials or placed as offerings. Most of all though, they ended up on the east coast of England, the other side of the country from where they were extracted. We're not sure why, but the people living here back then thought they were really special. It might be in part because the landscape here on the east coast, much of it fenland and marsh, was so very different from the dramatic peaks of Langdale. But from a practical point of view, the enormous production of these axes was perhaps also related to the huge demand for the tools needed by the growing population for land clearances, as well as of course for ritual or prestige objects. It's possible that the increased population density resulted in an even more pronounced social hierarchy, with the need to demonstrate that distinction through the creation of fine objects, the acquisition of exotic artifacts, and the construction of impressive monuments, because only a small proportion of the population were ever actually buried in these various tombs. These monuments were not only about individual differentiation though. Multiple people, men, women and children, were usually interred over a period of time, and so we know they were also about the group as well as the individual. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say it was more about the lineage than it was the heroic individual chieftain or king of the later Bronze Age round barrows of the Indo-European tradition brought in by the Bell Beaker people. The huge impact that these megalithic monuments had on the land was also about claims to territory, which would have been ever more important as the population increased. These monuments are often erected not just on prominent positions in the land, visible from miles around, but also, it is believed, on the borders between territories. Like many great human endeavours, these constructions were about many different things at once, and the people who built them had multiple motivations for doing so, but they were certainly about much more than just burial. And it's not only the tombs, of course. These people built other structures in the landscape at this time, structures like causewayed enclosures. They are a ring made up of short ditches, and the gaps between the ditches are the causeways that give them the name. From about 3700 BC, these begin to be constructed, until by 3500 BC they are found all over southern Britain. They used to find them all the time on the British archaeology TV series Time Team. They are part of a wider Neolithic European tradition, and there are many examples on the continent too. Exactly what they were is disputed. Special objects are often found deposited in the bottoms of the ditches, often enormous quantities of animal bone, and so they are often called ritual sites. Other people reckon they were used as cattle pens for trading or distributing animals, or for ritual feasting, and maybe all of these things happened and more, or none of them. Although the design of the enclosures has its origins on the continent, they were not built initially on arrival, only as the population increased. And so it has been suggested that their construction is related in some way to intergroup competition, because as the population peaks and declines, so does these enclosures. Of course, having a large population helps to provide the manpower for significant building projects, and when the population reduces, there are fewer people available to dig and maintain causewayed enclosures. First, by 3500 BC, no more are constructed, and by 3300 BC, they go out of use. No new ditches are dug, and old ones are no longer repaired. So this is part of the story of the decline. And by 3600 BC, those large halls, ritual centres or homes of the well-to-do, were no longer being built or used. And from about 3400, the flint mines of southern England were no longer dug, and those stone axe exchange networks dry up, and they stop being circulated. So the people apparently stop moving around so much, and contact between them reduces. As the decline continues, however, long barrows, cairns, linear monuments and other kinds of small structures do continue to be used, meaning people are interred and ritual activity takes place in and around them. But most things are done at a far smaller scale. It suggests they have other things to worry about, doesn't it? We get a hint of what life was like during the decline by the increase from about 3700 BC in the signs of conflict in the archaeological record. For example, palisades are erected around the enclosures and defensive earthworks dug. As enclosures start being abandoned, there comes the period between 3500 to 3200 BC when Cursus monuments are built. These are linear features, a pair of parallel banks and ditches that could be up to 100 metres or over 300 feet apart, and although most were in the range of about 150 metres or 500 feet long, they could be up to 5 kilometres or 3 miles long. Actually, Francis Pryor says the longest is over 10 kilometres or 6 miles. That's a lot of digging. Sometimes the ends were closed off and other times they were left open. So what were these massive constructions? How did they relate to the declining population, the abandonment of the causewayed enclosures and the increase in conflict? Well, it's thought that they were some sort of processional way, like a ritual avenue for the community. And because collections of arrowheads have sometimes been found at the ends of these monuments, some have suggested that they were used for herding and shooting animals, or for some sort of competition, or rite of passage, or, well, let your imagination go wild because we don't know. By this point in the story of the British Isles though, the landscape is already filled with monuments, and we should think of these places as entire ritual landscapes, with things like the Cursus monuments being best understood in relation to the other sites around them and the landscape as a whole. But all we can really say for sure is that because they took a lot of work, they must have been very important to these people's lives. However, after about 300 years, they too stopped being built, and everything changed again. So the population crash led to enormous changes for the people and the world that they created around them. After these changes came a new period of relative demographic and economic stability. As the population declined, their economy changed from farming wheat to farming barley to primarily cattle pastoralism, supplemented with the use of wild plant resources. This is in fact the longest period of the Neolithic here, and life was so different to how I imagined it. We would expect then that there would also be changes in social organisation between the peak and the equilibrium, perhaps with new traditions emerging or old ones being adapted to the new way of life. And in fact, it's in this context that the world-famous Irish passage graves like Nauthe and New Grange are built in the ritual landscape of the Boyne Valley from something like 3200 BC. These are truly remarkable monuments on a scale that suggests perhaps a new kind of concentration of power has arisen. This concentration of power is also seen over in England, where the first stage of Stonehenge was constructed in about 3000 BC or a bit after, although there are indications of far earlier activity here. This site is a unique combination of stone circle and henge monument, a henge being an inner ring ditch with outer bank. Initially, Stonehenge was a ditch with banks inside and outside, with the famous bluestones imported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, as well as cremation burials. There were other standing stones and wooden posts erected too, that aligned with midsummer sunrise and maybe with significant lunar positions. Stonehenge is the most famous and most spectacular of them today, but it was part of a trend in the region for new forms of enclosures all over Britain, although most others were smaller. And it's at this time, about 3000 BC, when those other world-famous late Neolithic monuments are built in the Orkney Islands, north of Great Britain. There was a major ritual centre and settlement complex at the Ness of Brodgar. This was an apparently unique, highly special place, the centre of its own world, possibly the most important site in Western Europe at this time. Surely there were people of immense power here. Monuments in this area include the stones of Stenness, a henge and stone circle, as well as the ring of Brodgar, and the amazing, quite new discovery of a kind of walled ceremonial centre. Excavations here are carried out every year and will be continuing for many years to come, and so we can look forward to more information about this site in future. There is also Maes Howe and the other Maes Howe type passage tombs, which seem to have been inspired by the earlier Irish Boyne Valley tombs. For example, the passages are also oriented along the midwinter solstice as they are in Ireland. We are left with these monuments today, so we can see that something important was happening here, but the individuals who made it happen are elusive. I want to know more about them, about what motivated them in life, what kind of power they actually wielded, how did they organise all this, but the lives of these people still feel just out of reach. As I mentioned earlier, they kept farming cereal crops up here until about 2850 BC, something like 500 years after the mainland. So the North Scottish Islands have a different pattern of boom and bust. In fact, they flourished, the Orkneys especially, long after the decline in mainland Britain. More than flourished, they were extraordinarily successful and created exceptional monuments and became the power centre of the region, and you might say all of the British Isles, and even beyond. Their social innovations and cultural expressions were so remarkable that they became cultural exports. The henge-type monument itself might have originated here and spread south. The pottery of the Orkneys, they call it grooved ware today, was likewise exported and emulated and used in the rest of Britain and Ireland, and found today mainly in ceremonial contexts, showing its deep ritual importance. So the Orkneys might have been a successor of sorts to the tomb innovations and ritual centre of the Boyne Valley. In this new period, after 3000 BC, these long-distance movement patterns and cultural contacts are well established, which makes sense considering almost everywhere now depended on cattle pastoralism. Regular movement of cattle became the norm. For example, it is thought that in some instances, cattle were driven all the way from Scotland down to the site of Durrington Walls, near Stonehenge, for the purpose of slaughter for vast ritual communal feasts. This was during the massive second phase of construction at Stonehenge, right at the end of the Neolithic period. Interestingly though, considering all this long-range movement throughout Britain, it seems that contact with continental Europe pretty much comes to an end. It seems as though the focus of these islands turns inward, and no wonder, because it was apparently a time of enormous spiritual authority in these islands, and they apparently had no need for or interest in anywhere else. This late period then was a reorganisation of society, resulting in a handful of enormously powerful regional centres, such as those of the Boyne Valley, Orkney and the Salisbury Plain. Again, we have to wonder, who were the rulers of these societies, and how did they organise such vast numbers of people? Should we think of these as chiefdoms or even kingdoms? Were they priest kings, wielding the power of the gods over their subject populations? At this point we just don't know for sure, but we can surely say that to build such things they must have had not only the vision, but the tenacity, the resolution to complete these feats, and the sheer ability to actually achieve it. That tells us a lot about their character, I think. It's this late period that is of most interest to me, because I'm currently researching Book 3 of my Gods of Bronze series, which will take place at this time, and I'm going to have to reconstruct this society for that novel. I don't make things easy for myself. If this culture had continued to develop, I wonder what kind of civilization would have emerged. Would it eventually have been similar in scale and artistic expression to the civilizations of the Mediterranean, like the Minoans on Crete? Sadly, we will never know what they might have achieved, because it was destined not to continue. In fact, within just a few years, these people would be all but gone, and Britain would be radically transformed once again. Because from about 2500 BC, a new people began to cross from continental Europe. Quite suddenly, in the archaeological record, new burial rituals appear, and copper and gold artefacts are found. Barley is once again grown in great quantities in the fields of Britain, brought by the newcomers. These were the Bell Beaker people, and they migrate just as the power centres like Stonehenge reach their height. What was it that brought them here in such huge numbers? Perhaps it was the enormous success of these magnificent monuments, these power centres and their kings, their fame reaching across the channel and arousing the interest and greed of the people there. As we have seen in previous videos, raiding was central to the Indo-European cultures of mainland Europe at this time. Perhaps then it was curious youths who were ejected from home and crossed the water to the west for their ritualised raiding period. Imagine what it was like for such young men climbing atop a ridge to see Stonehenge in the distance. Tales of such sights would have spread on their return. Maybe these same young men ultimately led their warriors across in great numbers when they became chiefs of their tribe. Whatever were the motivations, we know that the new people spread very quickly. Genetic evidence suggests that in just a few years, about 90% of the DNA of the Neolithic farmers was replaced by the newcomers. So although they are not a large part of our DNA, for anyone of British descent around the world today, the Neolithic farmers are nevertheless our ancestors, as are the hunter-gatherers who they had mixed with. Their heritage was carried forward by the Bell Beaker people, who would go on to inhabit the British Isles from then on, right through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age into historical times. In fact, even when the Anglo-Saxons migrated here in the post-Roman period, they were themselves Bell Beaker descendants who had stayed behind. We'll have to talk more about this transition period in future videos on the Bell Beaker people. The story of Neolithic Britain and Ireland covers about 1,500 years, and to my mind, it is a story of immense success. They were pioneers who paddled across dangerous seas with their animals and precious seeds in the bottoms of their boats. Once the distant shore was reached, they did not rest. Instead, these people continued to race off to new horizons, generation after generation. Exactly what was driving them, we can only imagine. Perhaps it was a hereditary elite of powerful chieftains, but they were a people of great energy and determination. After their first expansions, they transformed the landscape due to their expertise in toolmaking, home building and farming. This caused a massive increase in population over the next 300 or 400 years, and they began building monuments like long burrows and causewayed enclosures in great numbers. However, there was a severe decline in population over the following centuries, reaching a low point around 3000 BC. It could have been due to their own intensive activity, or it could have been the climate or disease perhaps, but it was not to be the end of these people. Far from it. What emerged from the decline was a new equilibrium, a new sustainable economy based almost entirely on cattle pastoralism. And now was the time when power in Britain and Ireland was concentrated and new forms of monuments were built on a massive scale. Indeed, they were thriving when they were overrun by the copper dagger wielding archers and raiders who were attracted perhaps by their enormous success, intending to take it for themselves. So as far as I'm concerned, the seafaring, cattle herding, master stonemasons of Neolithic Britain and Ireland are to be admired for their magnificent achievements and their tenacious, even heroic character. Thank you to my patrons who help to make these videos possible. To support the channel, please follow the link to Patreon in the description. There are also links to my novels, and if you liked this video then you should watch the playlists on the channel for more content like this. And please subscribe so you don't miss new videos on history and prehistory. Thank you for watching.